first went into watching It Comes at Night, my expectations were fairly mixed, and that was mostly because of what I'd heard either side of the fence from different reviewers. Some seemed to really like the film, some really didn't, and it's not necessarily the film's fault. It's actually the team who oversaw the marketing, in particular the trailer for the film. Now, this is one of those movies that if you haven't already seen the trailer, you probably have, but I'd recommend staying away from it. And the reason why isn't because it necessarily spoils anything in particular, it's more so because of the Prometheus effect. As I've mentioned before on the channel, the trailer presents it as being something that it quite simply isn't. People went into Prometheus expecting another Alien movie, and of course it's anything but. There are shades of Alien in there, but it's a completely different kind of sci-fi with elements of horror. Likewise with It Comes at Night. If you watch the trailer, you're probably going to think you're going into some kind of combination of 28 Days Later and some of those awesome kind of smaller horror monster films, some of my favourites for instance, like Splinter, Harbinger Down, or even more recently there are shades of Hereditary in there, although of course this came out before that anyway. So if you go into it expecting all of those things, you'll be disappointed, because it's not that kind of film at all. If you go into it though expecting 10 Cloverfield Lane for instance, then I think you might just like this movie, because there are some things about this film that I really liked, from a filmmaking point of view, from a storytelling point of view, both visually and in terms of how it actually plays out. But there are definitely some things towards the end of the film in particular, which of course I won't spoil, that I didn't like. And it's not one of those films that just goes like with a crazy twist for no apparent reason at the end. It's not that kind of movie. I mean more so choices that characters make, acting performances that just don't really fit with the rest of the film, or just get needlessly annoying, you could say. Now, It Comes at Night is of course the second movie directed by Trey Edward Shults, and a lot of people talk about the fairly obvious points in the film, like how the trailer was inaccurate, which I touched on, or Joel Edgerton's performance, because he is one of these actors who can pretty seamlessly jump between bigger films and these smaller passion projects very well, be it behind the camera or in front of it. And that's all true, it's all great, but it's also been said. So what I want to focus on is actually probably my favourite aspect of this movie. And that in particular is the performance of his son in the film, played by Kelvin Harrison Jr. Not anywhere near as well known a name, but I like that they chose to in effect make this his film, because of course, as always without spoiling anything too specific or in particular, the story itself is very simple. It's more of a character piece kind of movie, in a similar way to 10 Cloverfield Lane, where you don't get very much background information, and also A Quiet Place as well is a great example of a similar kind of film to this one, where it's not a big overarching scope kind of film. It's a very small, personal, self-contained, somewhat claustrophobic in terms of characters kind of movie. And I think it's all the better for it, because it allows for the budget to be very low, but as long as you get the right cast in there and good writing, you can do a lot with that. And what I'm getting at about this particular main character is that I like that the film took the approach of not being the typical way of telling a story like this, where it's about the parents arguing of what should be done, it's not about the father doing whatever's necessary for his family. All of those shades are in there, but when you really boil it down to its simplest form, the film is about a boy growing up, but in a very short span of time. And I actually like that, because most movies with this kind of style, this kind of story, don't really take that approach. It tends to be an obvious main character, one who takes charge and is at the forefront, whereas in this movie the main character isn't at the forefront, doesn't take charge. Most of the time he's being protected rather than protecting, and I actually kind of like that shift in focus. It's more about his experience than anyone else, really. And as I said, I wanted to allude to what the story itself actually is, because again, the trailers will make it seem very hazy, and it's super simple. The world, or at least America, it would seem, has fallen victim to a very pervasive disease. And they're just trying to survive this disease out in the middle of nowhere in their own home, and trying to come in contact with as few people as possible, surviving with their own way of life. They know their routine, typical kind of stuff. And of course something comes along to put a wrench in the works, where they're forced to work with other people. So it's almost like a very small element of like a zombie, like Walking Dead kind of TV series, where you'll have a family who are forced to work with outsiders, that kind of thing. But usually that would be like an episode or a plot point, whereas in this one, it's the whole film. And I actually do like that, because it makes the film feel that much more personal. It expands a story which could just be a scene into a whole concept, but it also justifies that being done to it. It's not just for the sake of it. As far as the horror aspects of the film, well, this is more the Andromeda Strain school of horror, if you will, where it's more about what's implied than what's actually shown. But, as the Andromeda Strain shows, that's very effective when done well. That's one of my absolute favourite movies, so that, again, bodes pretty well for this one. As far as the stuff that lets it down, I think that once you put the trailer to one side, because, let's be honest, that's not really the director's fault. Who knows if he even had a say in how the trailer was cut. It could have been completely different people involved, so I'm not going to put that onus on him. So with that to one side, I think that the only thing about the film that straight up disappointed me, or even annoyed me actually, was, as I mentioned earlier, the way certain characters act toward the end. Not because it's completely unjustified or ridiculous necessarily, it's just there's a certain way of writing characters making mistakes that feels understandable, that you can kind of justify it, you can identify with it. People under pressure, people do make mistakes, of course, and there's a way of writing that well, where you can actually get behind the character and support them. Then there's this way of writing it, and for me it just made me find the characters excruciatingly annoying towards the end of the film, and it almost ruined the experience, I will say. Now, I think that the film actually ended strong, but it certainly wasn't because of those particular character choices in the third act. It kind of wastes what it had built up for me, and it's still not enough to make me dislike the film. I actually do like it overall, but I feel that that's probably the limit for me. This is never going to be one of my absolute favourites within this kind of genre. I think that 10 Cloverfield Lane, for instance, certainly A Quiet Place, is a better example of this kind of story, whereas this one I think reaches maybe 80% of its potential, and it just doesn't quite make the finish line. And it's not that I don't have issues with those other two films as well, for sure, but I think they're just a little bit more rounded than this film, in effect. Now, as far as my individual scores go for stuff like the story, the effects, the music, all that kind of good stuff, I kind of went back and forth, especially when it comes to stuff like the characters and the story, because, as I said, there are certain things which are really good, really refreshing, really well done, and then there are others which just come off as straight up lazy to push the ending of the film along, the plot along, and it really felt like a cop-out after it had been so meticulously well-paced up until that point. The film has some genuine character-based interpersonal tension, and it wasted it at the end, as far as I'm concerned. However, that does not change the fact that it did a lot of things well. I liked the pacing, I liked the tone, I liked the atmosphere, I liked the fact that it chose to have, in effect, like two lead characters in the form of the son and the dad, but whereas typically it would be completely about the father and his emotional experience, what he's going through, protecting his family, and as I said, there is elements of that in there, there are elements, but at the same time it's more so about the son, and although I don't particularly need it to be, it was a nice change, and it was an unexpected one to see play out that way, and I did like that. So I'm going to give it a 7 as far as the story goes. For me, it did enough things right to outweigh my one gripe, because that one gripe is to do with the story and characters, of course, but still, I do like a lot of the things that they did with it. As far as those characters, the casting, the performances, and of course the motivations and decisions in particular, I'm actually going to give it another 7, and that's pretty generous, given how annoyed I was toward the end of the film. But again, the reason why is because just like with the story, the rest of the movie makes up for it so much in terms of how good they are, how believable they are, and also I liked in particular that usually a film like this, a film where you have different families or different groups ending up together, they always have this same kind of approach to it where there's one guy or a couple of people who kind of act like a weasel in the situation, where they kind of split the family apart or split a couple apart, and kind of like The Gift, if you will, that kind of thing. Again, of course, with Joel Edgerton. I don't really like those movies, I just find them annoying. In this one they don't do that, because what I did like is that even with stupid decisions and characters who are very different, some of whom you have more of an attachment to than others, you can understand where all of them are coming from, and you can understand why they're doing what they're doing. Apart from, of course, near to the end. So for me, I am still going to give it a 7. If the ending was different, if it was written differently, it could have easily been an 8, to be honest, maybe even a 9. I feel that they were that good the rest of the time. As far as the visuals, the effects, the camera work, again I'm going to give it another 7, actually, because although pretty much all of the horror effects are shown in the trailer, and don't get your hopes up too high for those because they're literally a few seconds here and there, it's well done when it is done. It's more about the tone, it's more about a conversational kind of tension rather than a visual tension, but there's also, sound, and the visuals do play into that. It's a remote location, a lot of trees, a very claustrophobic house that's boarded up, locked down most of the time. So again, you've got that kind of 28 Days Later dark vibe where they're all locked up inside and huddled together, that kind of feel, and it works. It's a good natural way of having people together to cause tension and to have claustrophobia. So I did like that. I like the visuals of the film. The brief seconds of traditional horror visuals are pretty cool as well, but again, you see everything in the trailer anyway, so you're kind of like, oh well, okay, that was that, and now we've moved on again. So again, I would love to score it even higher, but I don't feel that it would really be justified in doing so. As far as the soundtrack, the music, well, beat a dead horse, I'm going with the 7 again. And the reason why is because a movie like this will always depend very much so on its sound design. Just like movies such as The Babadook or Black Mountainside do also. It's as much about the lack of sound as it is sound, because it's not really a jump scare kind of thriller or horror. It's a tension horror like The Witch, The Babadook, Black Mountainside. It's this relentlessly building tension and dread, and especially tension in the case of this movie, that makes it work. And of course the soundtrack and the sound effects in particular will always have a very important role in that. And I think that this movie has some pretty good sound design, actually. Very good, actually, across the board. And of course that brings us finally to, of course, the most subjective of all, the rewatchability and entertainment factor for me. For that one, I am going to give it a slight drop to a 6. And the reason why I'm giving it a 6 is because if it was purely me, which you might think, well, of course it's purely me, but bear with me, if it was purely me, will I ever watch this film again? I might give it a 5, because I think there is a 50-50 chance that I may or may not watch it again. However, as I've said before, these kind of films, especially one like this which is only 92 minutes long, it's only an hour and a half movie, and it really flies by. It feels more like an hour, actually, sometimes, and I think that actually makes the rewatchability improved, especially to show other people or to watch it as a group. But as I've said with a couple of other films, it does need to be more so the kind of group who are all into the idea of sitting down and watching a movie without talking too much. Because of course, being a very sound or lack thereof based film, just like A Quiet Place, you need to pay attention. So if it's like a party, then of course not, it's just going to be wasted. You might as well not have the TV on at all. Whereas if it's, as I said, people who want to watch a film like this, then sure, it's definitely got rewatchability there, which is why I bump it up from a 5 to a 6. The reason why I don't go super high is because the limited scope of the story, although great, doesn't for me lend itself to rewatchability that much. It's the kind of film where you go through an experience with it, and then that's kind of it. I didn't feel the need to relive that experience again. Plus, I will freely admit that the character's actions toward the end, it tainted it for me. It did hurt the film, and I hate to say that because the rest is so strong. But overall, that means that I'm giving it a very respectable score of 3.4 out of 5, and definitely check it out if you haven't already. If you're into films like the ones that I mentioned, such as The Babadook, Black Mountainside, but more so stuff like 10 Cloverfield Lane and A Quiet Place, then you might enjoy this one, or at least you'll probably enjoy aspects of it, if not the whole thing. So that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, Thanks for watching.